Every behavior is natural. This statement might sound weird to some people because we all have some conception of what it means to act in a natural or normal way. We all talk about things that we quote unquote naturally want or naturally despise. We talk about behaviors that are based in evolutionary history and stuff like that. And as a result, we have this conception of nature that is actually completely false, whereby nature in some way dictates what kinds of behaviors fall within its normal limits or its natural way, and behaviors that deviate from those normal or natural limits are kind of abnormal or unnatural. And this is a common misconception about how beings evolve, especially how human beings evolve. We have this idea that every being wants to survive, and therefore everything that it does is centered around survival, at least when you probe deep enough. But here is the problem. Evolution is simply the process of genes interacting with their current environments. And of course, for any given environment, certain genetic expressions are going to lead to higher rates of survival and higher rates of reproduction of those genes, whereas some other genetic expressions are going to lead to less replication and less survival. But this doesn't mean that our genes are somehow guided by the invisible hand of nature so that we can survive. It's just that the majority of genes that end up existing in a given population are mostly genes that either help you survive or are not prohibiting you from surviving. So this is the first important realization, that nature doesn't guide you into doing anything. Nature doesn't make your genes do something. It doesn't prefer any kind of gene over another. There is no standard of normality or abnormality that is objective outside of the arbitrary sense of being statistically abnormal, which means simply rare. Because in reality, genes simply express themselves, and some of them die, and some of them replicate. This is all that happens. The only reason that there seems to be a natural way of things, the only reason that it seems as if nature prefers certain things over others, is because we look at evolution after a very long time, whereby two important things have happened. The first is that most of the genes that don't help you replicate or survive have been either eradicated from the population or severely diminished, and the genes that help you replicate and survive have been made more because they replicate themselves. And also this gets, of course, combined with random mutations that create new genetic expressions, which go through the exact same filter. And this is where the second point comes in, which is that mutations happen randomly. And it is not as if you are being changed into a certain kind of being because it's more natural to be that sort of being instead of something else. You're just becoming a certain kind of being because all the other ways of becoming a certain kind of being don't help you survive. So it's simply a matter of a number of random changes happen to your genetic code, none of which are inherently natural or unnatural, and it's just that after a long time frame, the ones that you're going to see when you look around are those that happen to survive and replicate. And again, there is no guiding hand behind this. Now, if you have studied biology to any degree, you are most likely familiar with the previous ideas. But now it's time to mention a bit of a more nuanced idea, and that is the concept of what is called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. In simple terms, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness is the kind of environment for which a certain gene is well adapted. It is the kind of environment in which the gene replicates itself and becomes spread through the population. So, for example, you can imagine that the emotion of fear is highly adaptable for creatures that have predators to protect themselves from. So, for example, if you are the sort of creature that has to deal with predators, you're going to survive way more times than other creatures of your sort if you have the feeling of fear, because of course it's going to make you aware of the danger and more likely than not to either fight or flight, so you can then survive. But what happens when those predators go away? What would happen if you evolved this feeling of fear and then after a certain time period the primary predator that you were afraid of becomes extinct? Well, what would happen is you would still have fear, because even though in the current environment of evolutionary adaptedness fear is not particularly useful, you still have it because it evolved when the environment was such that fear would have been very useful. So as you can see, it's not as if fear is natural or unnatural. Fear is simply one kind of combination of genetic expressions which happens to have helped most people at some time survive and replicate. And so, as a result, you see it more often. This doesn't mean that it's in any way more or less normal than the kind of genetic combination that makes you be calm. It just happened to win out when the environment was such that it needed it. And so when you see some behavior in a human in these days and you think, well, this is unnatural, or this is, this goes against whatever preconceived notion of normalcy one might have, you have to think about it in evolutionary terms. Just because some behaviors or some, emotions have evolved in a certain kind of way doesn't make them any more natural than a completely different, drastically different kind of way of experiencing or of behaving. It's just that these emotions and these behaviors happened to win out at a certain environmental condition. So when you see a behavior that is very different or very strange, you have to think that for any given environment there is a different set of adaptable behaviors. And so there is no set natural or normal behavior or emotion. And even if a behavior does not aid replication in the long or the short term, this still doesn't make it unnatural, because it is just as natural to have random mutations and random combinations of genetic expressions that help survival, just as it is to have such expressions that don't help survival and replication. We simply have a very strong bias against those sorts of behaviors and expressions that don't replicate, because we have evolved with genes that motivate us to prefer genes that were more likely to replicate during the environment of evolutionary adaptedness of those motivational genes. So yes, this is my thesis. There is no such thing as inherently natural or unnatural behavior, unless we speak about it in a very trivial manner. Thank you for watching this video, and please leave a comment if you have some opinion about this matter. Thank you.